All right, everyone, welcome, welcome. As I talk, I imagine some folks will also continue to enter the talk. Hopefully, everybody who signed up is able to jump in, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Michael Diamond. I'm the academic director for the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department here at NYU School of Professional Studies in our Division of Programs in Business. And it's absolutely my pleasure, as it has been on several occasions this academic year, to collaborate with George Benaroya in a wonderful program that he's curated for us and for his students as part of his Finance for Marketing Decisions class, but very much focused on global decision making and giving us an opportunity to invite into the class, into our community, some really important and distinguished global decision makers, global leaders, global managers, global marketers and communicators. And it's in that spirit we're delighted to welcome Michael Gonda. As many of you know, Michael leads as the Chief Communications Officer for McDonald's globally all of the work that they do. I think upon his announcement, it talked about ensuring the company speaks with a consistent voice. He's working to help drive authentic content and connect essentially the impact of the work and the words of McDonald's with consumers. And as Katie Fallon reminded us all, and for many of those who joined, this is a larger project and initiative around building brand trust for McDonald's. And so we're really delighted, absolutely, to welcome Michael and to have him share some of his thinking at a time, obviously, for our country and for our industry at some level. That's absolutely critical to think about the relationship between words and actions and the sorts of corporate voice with which big companies can speak and the power and influence they have to act. So delighted to welcome Michael, and we'll turn it over to George in his classroom.
Thanks, Michael. For those of you that I don't know yet, my name is George Benaroya. What I do is, during the day, I work as a CFO. I started my career at Procter & Gamble, then Tetra Pak, Nivea, and now I work in private equity. Now, once per week, I get to do something I love, and that is to teach this class. Now, let me explain what's happening. So you have joined a real class. This is not an event. A real class going on now at NYU's School of Professional Studies. And what we do in this class is the first day, students pick a company, any company they like among over 500. And they pick McDonald's. And then we learn finance by having students make business decisions. First, headcount, then pricing. With McDonald's, it was super cool because we had the Big Mac data saying that it sells for $5.77 in New York City and over $7 in Switzerland, $7.29, and less than $2 in Russia, $1.81 in Moscow. And so we debated whether we should have a local, national, or global price list. Now, for McDonald's, it was easy, but at companies like Nike or Apple, there were different views about it. So we foster that in class. It's not about the numbers, but it's about how do we use numbers to make meaningful comments in a persuasive way. These were the price recommendations by students, and there are no right or wrong numbers per se. So Grace recommended a 1%, and she explained why. Sienna at 3%, and Sush 4%. The other thing that we do is we have students communicate to the other team, where they pretend to be customers, these price increases to see how they will react to it and so on. And here's one example from Emily. And then what we do, and this will be a spoiler for students coming the next semester, is we tell them that customers are very upset about the price increases they have implemented, and they have to decide how they will react to it. What will they do not to lose those customers? The other thing we do in class is to look at a problem that companies have when there is a lot of demand and not enough inventory. Should we prioritize all customers, stores open over a year in the case of McDonald's? Should we prioritize new customers, stores we opened last week? Or should we go by hand and look up the 40,000 stores we have and prioritize, say, those close to a hospital and tell our heroes, listen, because we appreciate the work you do, we're going to give you a chance to try the new sandwich first. How do we do it? How do we make those decisions? So here is one record from Moss, and they have 10 or 12 slides. This is just one summary. And here's a different one from AB. Now, last week when Bob, who is the corporate VP of supply chain, was with us, he did mention that that doesn't happen at McDonald's, that they have a real good process to make sure that they are never sold out. But that is the whole idea, right? The third step is to invite senior executives from these companies to tell us how they make these decisions in real life. As Michael said, our guest speaker today is Michael Gonda, the Chief Communications Officer at McDonald's. And I think that, the three key things that he does is, as Michael Diamond mentioned, the idea of how to increase brand trust, advance corporate reputation, and build organizational clarity. At a more personal level, what I think is interesting about his background is that back in 2012, Michael moved physically to Beijing, China, and he was helping while he was with Weber Shandwick, global multinationals, deal with crisis management. When he came back at the Greek yogurt maker Chobani, he developed strategies in PR and in marketing, and one of them reached 4.6 billion with a B impressions. So typically when students make these recommendations, I would say, well, what was the impact on sales? Giovanni is a private company, but we figured that when he was there, Michael Gonda, over 4 years for this billion-dollar brand, sales probably doubled. So it's my real pleasure to welcome today Michael Gonda.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I'll just start by saying what an honor it is to have the opportunity to share a bit about personally my journey, but also what we're doing as a company. I will say that maybe surprisingly or unsurprisingly, when you hold a communications role at a company, you're very seldom getting in front of others and talking. Partly that's by design and partly that's out of utility. So this is probably the first time I've actually spoken, which I can say with certainty, the first time I've spoken with people outside of the company about what I do inside of the company. And I am deeply grateful for all the insightful time that you've spent looking into what we've been doing and really, really eager to get into this. I will just say at the outset, I lacked all of the incredible training and education that each of you have. I went to school thinking very seriously about being a journalist and tried my hand at that for a little while. So I share that only to say that you guys are well ahead of me. And also everything I'm describing is in a way my plan B, my fallback plan. And I think that anything I've been able to do since pursuing plan B has been through a couple of very fortunate circumstances. One, having incredible mentors, and two, being surrounded by incredibly generous and hardworking people that I've been able to grow with and learn from and work with. And that follows me today to McDonald's. I hold a position on the team, but I would say that I'm one of 43 people on the global comms team, probably more than 200 people on the global impact team that every day are focused on the same things that I am. So as I share some of our perspectives or some of my perspectives, I do so hopefully on their behalf as well. So with that, George, I'm happy to turn it back over to you and see where we can go, or Michael.
Super. So, the way we do is we have students ask the questions directly. So they'll come closer to the mic and they will ask only once. And then we will have also the opportunity to take questions from the audience and so on. And depending on how much time that we have, we will get to those as well. So I think the first question is from Emily.
We're frozen.
Are we frozen or are you able to see us?
We see you fine. We don't see Emily though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Might be frozen.
Yeah, we're frozen. So it is sort of frozen then.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's
And
try
then
this.
you don't have to see
Actually,
it.
you might be frozen. Yeah. Just keep going, Emily. And
Yeah.
George, if you want to turn on and off your camera, you
Oh,
should.
can you see me?
There you go.
Here we go.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
What is it like managing the voice of a global brand? Do you feel the pressure of always having to be perfect? And what does it feel like when something goes wrong?
Great question right out of the gate. I'll take it in a couple different directions. One, I would say that well, first of all, it's an honor to be able to have a part in managing the voice of a brand that is as, I think, globally important and locally relevant as McDonald's. We operate in upwards of 35 to 39,000 communities around the world. We have obviously a very strong presence and heritage here in this country, but really in basically every region. So if you start with that size and that scale, you can very quickly become, I think, intimidated and get to that point, Emily, that you're talking about, of this pressure to always be perfect, or to have to scrutinize every last comma. I think that more important, particularly where we sit today and what a customer or a stakeholder is looking for, is less about perfection in communication and more about humanity in communication. And I think a little bit about, when I was at Chobani previously, we talked a lot about this concept of, when you're small, you want to seem big, and when you're big, you want to seem small. And I think that that's probably true. I would adjust it a little bit and say that you want to demonstrate your local relevance, even as you, in our case, have a global impact. So it's less about perfection, more about humanity, and really studying the impact that you have on an individual level. In terms of the initial part of managing the voice, alignment is important. So you want to drive towards consistency for sure. As a customer travels from one country to another, as a customer reads about your brand, engaging in one country when they may be sitting in another, it needs to feel consistent. And I think that's important. But I also don't know that you can be locally relevant if you're trying to perfectly synchronize every single message, because the expectation of someone in, pick a country, will be very different than the expectation of someone in another. And I think that that's something that you have to be acutely aware of when you're working with a global brand that has that importance and that community touch point like ours does. You asked about what it feels like when something goes wrong. And I would say you have to get pretty comfortable with that reality. And particularly when you're working in a communication space, our reality is that there's a lot that we cannot control. I don't know what's going to happen in the McDonald's news cycle that's unplanned tomorrow. So I need to be well prepared, and my team needs to be well prepared for the fact that whatever we think Friday brings, something very, very different may come in the door. What we can control is ensuring that our people, in the corporate side of it, that's 250,000. When you capture in all of the employees that work within our franchise side of the business, that's more than 2 million around the world, that they have a clear sense of what we stand for, what our purpose is, what our values are, what our mission is, and what are some of the important milestones and decisions that the company's making. So I don't know what's coming tomorrow, but I know that I can control that. If I do know that something unexpected or undesired is coming, I can ensure that I've worked and the team has worked hard to give people the context of what that situation may be, and what it means for our business. And I think that that's something that when you have a large organization, you have to really think hard about the context you're providing to that entire organization. And Emily, I don't want to over answer this, but I'll give you an example of a story that took place 2 weeks ago. There was a a story in Fortune magazine about our company. Really good reporter, Beth Coet. I've known Beth for a long time. It was not the story that we would seek to be in the news for, but Beth did diligent reporting. She participated in a series of different interviews before she even reached out to us. And ultimately, she worked very, very, very hard, I think, to write as accurate of a story as she could possibly do within her situation. The next day, there was a financial column that ran in Financial Times. And that reporter never reached out to us. They made assertions about our business, and I think, took too far of a leap in drawing certain conclusions about what we were doing as a company. The Fortune article has a bigger impact, I think, than Financial Times, but the Financial Times story really got to me because it was an example of journalism that could have been better. And I think that rather than the pressure to be perfect, you have to put some pressure on the journalists in particular that you're working with and really ask for their diligence, their duty, I think, to work with you. And I ended up writing a letter to the editor and voicing everything that I'm saying to this group right now. And I didn't do that with Fortune, right? So it's not just about the positivity of the story. I think it's really trying to control the process that leads to those outcomes as well. And not sitting there and only getting defensive if there's a story that you may not like or you may have not have wanted. So sorry, a long first answer, Emily, but I appreciate you asking it.
Thanks very much, Michael. Amy, what to go next? For those of you that don't know, I have read and heard that you try to read the entire New York Times every day. Is that somewhat true, or is it gross exaggeration?
Okay, so I think it's broadened a little bit. I'm not sure if I'm getting through all of the New York Times every day, but we'll talk about that. I think that reading the news is both a duty and a skill set, and I think it's really, really, really important in just in society, but I think especially within this profession.
Hi, Michael.
Hey.
How is building up brand trust at McDonald's different than at Chobani? Is there more of a stigma around fast food and therefore difficulties building trust with it?
It's a great question, and I mean I'll hook a little bit onto the big small piece that I was touching on with Emily's question, but I would just say that whether you're talking about building trust or sales, things always get a little bit more challenging when you're working off of a larger base. So the base, whether it's the reputational base, the sales base, et cetera, of a 66-year-old global company looks obviously very, very different than the base of a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old domestic company. So everything gets a little more challenging. That needle gets harder to move. When you're a more mature company, just in terms of longevity, people already have their own perceptions of you. And I think oftentimes that's not a bad thing. When I talk about a brand like McDonald's, wherever you are in the world, there's a pretty good chance that for many of our customers, that they've grown up with this brand, right? So they have their own experiences with it. So separate and apart from what we might be saying or doing this year, that experience with the brand is something that they carry with them, and they form their own impressions of their trust for us. So it can certainly be a strength, but I think you have to acknowledge that the needle gets a little bit more challenging. I would also just say that today, present day, the expectations of large brands are very, very different than what they may have been 20 years ago. The idea of the faceless large corporation doesn't really pass the customer expectation today. So, I think I heard in the upfront this idea of corporate voice. I think that today for a corporation, corporate voice is almost the enemy that we all need to be guarding against. There's an expectation, if you're going to really earn the trust of an individual, that you're going to be transparent, that you're going to speak humanely, and that you are going to weigh in on different topics and issues that are authentic to the brand, but also important to the community. And so that's something that may not be necessarily different from a smaller brand, but it's certainly more complicated when you're talking about multiple markets and 65 million customers a day that are engaging with you. But I would go back to the local relevance, global impact. as being a through line between the small and the large.
Thanks, Michael. This question is about trust, and the background is last semester we had the Chief Communications Officer from Estee Lauder, and the student, Caroline Arnos, asked for the exact same question. And the question is, a company establishing trust with customers is critical. In what ways can a company enhance that trust in the digital space?
It's a great question. So I'll just start with one kind of cliche answer, and that is I think transparency is very important, particularly in the digital space. I think that people are coming looking for something, hoping for something from you. And the reason, if you look in the US, for instance, you've got probably about 3/4 of the population that are not on Twitter, right? That are not on these larger digital platforms that our brand is engaging with. So, okay, so who are the people that are there, and what are they expecting? They're expecting either a brand experience or a brand point of view. And I think if you're not providing that to them, I don't know that you're necessarily, well, you could be losing trust, but you're certainly not gaining trust. So I would go back to being very, very intentional with how you're engaging in that space, and what you're saying. The only thing I would caution, I think we get a little bit caught up in digital as this new frontier. It's not anymore. I mean, for most of our customers, it's not just, digitally proficient, they're digitally native. But at the same time, that's not their number one experience with our brand, for instance. So while digital is very important, so is the experience that someone has in our restaurant. If you're a CPG brand, that experience that they're having with your product is oftentimes the number one driver of preference and trust. So I would caution that digital is obviously critical. It is important to be transparent, and yet there is still, a very critical part of the physical experience as well.
Thanks, Michael. My question is about headcount. So in the work that I do in finance, the number of people we hire over the last 10 years has been reduced by about half, right? Now, what is interesting about communications is that in your case, you're getting a lot more work, I would argue, right? Because in the old days, you would just issue a press release and people would read that and so on. But now you have consumers actually creating content. So my question is the headcount at large global companies increasing in communications? Are you guys hiring more people because you have so much more work to do?
Well, I will plug our team right now and say that across the Global Impact team, we are in fact hiring. So for anyone that is seeking the experience of working at a 66-year-old company with a startup heart, McDonald's is definitely a place to look at. But more seriously, I think that it really depends, George, on the company. So yes, we're growing right now. And I think that really comes from a lot of different factors, more unique to McDonald's. I think we had an opportunity to invest more deeply in our communications function. And that comes with the support of the business. And I think that there are new skill sets within communications that companies haven't necessarily had, and they're realizing are critical. And one example I'll give within McDonald's communications function is our data intelligence, or what we call performance and insights. So in the age that you're talking about with press releases, that was not the communications function. But today we rely heavily on insights to assess risk for our overall global listening, and then to analyze the performance of our campaigns and our activities. And we're hiring people that certainly wouldn't have been the typical members of a communications team probably 5 or 6 years ago, if I would dare say. So it's an investment. I think it's a testament to how important trust and brand have become to corporations. And I think that's something that you'll see more and more for those companies that maybe hadn't made that investment yet. that they're going to see the need to, and I think a lot of opportunities will expand because of it.
Super. Thanks for that. The next question is from Grace.
Hi, Michael. I have a question. As a Chief Communication Officer responsible for delivering a consistent message, how much freedom can you delegate to countries to create their own content?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, right? You want freedom, and you certainly want to foster freedom, and that gets back. It's impossible to be locally relevant if you don't enable that. I mean, take Toyota maybe as an example, right? If Toyota spent all of its time simply translating the messages that were coming out of its own headquarters, I don't know that they would have the resonance within the United States where we sit that they do. And so I think you need to create both an infrastructure and a strategy that celebrates freedom. I also think the other side of that coin is that for a brand to have durability, for people to understand what to expect from it, it needs to stand for a few core things. I think a lot of brands you see that do wonderful things, particularly around purpose and impact, it can sometimes, if you mapped all of the issues around the world that they're standing for, it can start to look a little bit like random acts of distraction or random acts of impact or kindness even. And that's the danger, because that lack of consistency creates inefficient use of resources. And I think it creates a very mixed message for your customers. So I would say you want a framework that allows for local adoption. And that's something that we've worked a lot on. In fact, in the last year, even here at McDonald's, right? 66 years, we're taking stock of that. And I'd be happy to share a bit of that work. But you want some freedom. And I think a couple things need to be core. A brand needs to have a purpose. I don't think you can have a German purpose and a Brazilian purpose and an American purpose and a Chinese purpose. I think that ultimately you're looking for a purpose that travels. It's often engaging with customers in similar ways, selling similar products. I think the same would be clear of its articulation of its mission. And then certainly when you talk about global values, which is increasingly important to a number of stakeholders, that's something that really can't deviate. And I'll get a little bit more into this, but we have 4 areas where we think we have the right and responsibility to drive trust and have an impact. And those 4 areas are global. And we spent a lot of time over the last year figuring that out. But how a market brings that to life is a tremendous amount of freedom. And I think a tremendous amount of creativity within that. But we do ask them to stay within these 4 pillars. And I'll just share them now. One is around our commitment to our planet. The other is around our food quality. The third is around jobs, empowerment, and inclusion. And the fourth is around community connection. And that gets to the fact that we have, a presence in 39,000 communities around the world. So how you communicate your demonstration of that in Germany versus Brazil versus the US may differ and should differ. But we ask that your work around trust do conform to those 4 areas so that we can have that consistency. And that enables us to show really how we are living our purpose, how we are bringing our values to life, how our mission is actually having an impact in the world.
Thanks, Michael. Michael Dano, do you have any questions, or maybe if we can squeeze one of yours?
Yeah, well, I think that, maybe building on this question around corporate voice and an authentic voice and not sounding like a big corporation, linking that to the statements you were just making, Michael, about, which issues you choose. I guess my question would be, we even within those 4 pillars, those 4 big areas you've identified where you can have impact and brand trust, you must at any given point feel pulled or drawn into a number of different issues that you could actually, speak to, support, respond to, etc. I just wonder if you could share with us a little bit of the calculus, that you go through as a communications leader to to think that through and, come to a position that you think is comfortable for the company?
Yeah, it's obviously very, I think, topical just in this past year. And for us, well, let me say this, for a large corporation, you're right, that on any given day, there's something going on that will raise the question of, do we need to say something? Do we need to say something? And without some sense of, without a framework for how the company should be thinking about it, it can be very disorienting. And for us, we have been able to rely upon some of these planks that I was talking about: our purpose, our values, these 4 pillars, which we shorthand within McDonald's describe as our leadership platform. We really rely on those to understand if it's something that connects to our values, that connects to our purpose, that connects to our leadership platform, and if we have an authentic right to speak up. That's something that we would do, and we have done. I would say that all that being true, when you have a lot of employees around the world, regardless of what you're going to say externally, there's an increasing sense of attention of what you're going to say internally. And I think that is something that many companies are struggling with right now. And we've found equally some clarity in our own thinking when we go back to our values and we go back to our this framework that I've been describing to help us understand, if we're going to say something, then what would we say? I wouldn't go as far as say it's worked for us, but I think it's certainly been very helpful for us.
Yeah, George, I can pick up 1 or 2 others if you want that are in the Q&A. And so there's a question here, I think, about communicating around sustainability and more generally a regenerative agriculture. And I guess the question is framed, at least, and you may not take this you may not take this on face value, but that for a company that wasn't, let's say, traditionally positioned as healthy, or the food, or the packaging being environmentally friendly, what do you think is the journey you've been on to reposition the company, I guess, around more sustainable and regenerative, sort of circular economy, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I would say probably a couple things on that, especially when you zoom out, look at us as a global business, and maybe not just from the lens of what someone's experiencing in one market. When I joined, I was astounded by the work that had been done around, the broad theme of sustainability, whether that was, science-based targets, some really bold commitments across our supply chain, some of which I think Bob may have even touched on. But it was very clear that McDonald's had been this kind of humble, and I would even dare say quiet leader, especially within our sector in this space. That said, I think that there is a rising tide, no pun intended, with expectations that will only increase. I mean, if you look no further than the announcements coming out today on Earth Day, it's very clear that there is a different level, a hyper level of focus on what companies are doing. Our CEO, Chris Kempczinski, was speaking yesterday with Senator John Kerry as part of a panel with the World Wildlife Fund. And when you think of the World Wildlife Fund, you may not have thought, oh, I'm sure McDonald's will be showing up there. We've actually been a long-standing partner with them. So I think, Michael, if I'm kind of landing at two points, we've been quiet. I don't know that that's to our benefit. I think there's a lot that people want to hear about that this company's been doing, because it'll have a serious impact on the future. And then I think we'll look at where the heightened ambition will be met with even heightened action, building what I think is a pretty strong legacy.
Excellent. George, send it back to you, George, in the class.
All right, thanks very much. So let's move into competition. Sienna, you want to go ahead?
Hi, Michael. So my question is, how does McDonald's deal with competitors like Shake Shack and Chick-Fil-A who are targeting young customers? Thank you.
Well, it is a great question, so thank you for that. I'll probably dance a little bit around this one, but try to speak more in the realm of what I see. I think from a communication standpoint, maybe even from I'd say a marketing standpoint, which is an adjacent swim lane to mine. I think we equally feel a right and a need to meet the needs of those customers. So I don't think we approach that from a defensive point of view of, well, are others playing there differently? Again, 66 years into our journey, I think we felt like we've always been very connected to a number of different demographics, including younger customers, and that remains incredibly important today. And I think the company's done an amazing job. If I'm a little bit biased, forgive me. When you look at even something that we announced this week around, a famous orders program with BTS, right? I mean, it's brilliant in that it requires no new complexity out of the restaurants, and it speaks to a very humble truth that regardless of your age group or where you are in the world, everyone has their go-to favorite order. And whether you're BTS or you're one of us, you've got your go-to McDonald's order. And I think those are things that are just very unique to McDonald's. I mean, you can't really see anyone else being able to do that, and particularly not to do it in a way that feels authentic and done across 50 different countries or almost 50 different countries simultaneously. So I think the company's done some really awesome things. And again, 2 years in, it's been pretty cool to see particularly how we've increased, I think, our relevance within that demographic.
Super. I think there is a follow-up question from Jay. Go ahead, Jay.
Hi, how are you? Quick question. Is there a way for a brand to appeal to millennials and adults at the same time simultaneously?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it connects a little bit to the prior example too. But I would say the prior question. I would say that I don't know that it's an either or, and maybe even speaking less as a McDonald's executive, but just as a observer and a practitioner in our industry. I don't think that the brands that really stand out say, okay, I'm just going to stand up for or engage with a specific demographic at the expense of another. So I think the question really becomes, what do different generations have in common? And where are ways that the brand can help, or I think not even help, can stand for some of those issues. And for us, I look at our purpose and our values. I don't know that is unique. So this purpose of feeding and fostering community is really important to a millennial. It's obviously very important to older generations. So I think that there are some really powerful through lines throughout that. And then you activate different programs that really speak to that individual demographic in a way that is special and unique for them. And BTS is an example of probably us reaching a younger demographic. But I think that there's a number of different initiatives that we do around the world that speak to to older generations as well. So I guess my short answer is yes, you can appeal to both, and even more so, I think you must appeal to more than just one generation.
Thanks, Michael. The next question is about strategy and Sush, if you want to go. And Michael Diamond, I think that we also have other questions coming about strategy. So if you want after Sush, maybe you can ask some of those. Go ahead.
Sure.
My question is, when McDonald's changed its growth strategy from velocity growth plan to accelerating the arches any lessons learned in that process?
Well, so for context, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We did that last year. I take a deep breath because it was a tremendous undertaking. Obviously the strategy and the thinking that goes into it, takes a tremendous amount of work and did. The way that our CEO and others have described that strategy is evolutionary, not revolutionary. So a lot of the elements of the velocity growth plan, would carry through. But I would say that unique to that moment, we were going through a pandemic. We had gone through some different transitions within our own company as well. And I think if we had just communicated externally and said, okay, this is our business strategy, we ran the risk of not bringing our own people along on that journey. So for as much effort as we put into communicating the Accelerating the Arches strategy to our stakeholders outside of the company, we spent just as much, frankly, if not more, I'd say, communicating that to our what we call the three legs of the stool, our franchisees, our suppliers, and our employees. And I think that was critical. And if we had used the pandemic as an excuse to not do that, it would have been a real misfire. Because, now several months into 2021, it's really important that people understand what the concepts of Accelerating the Arches entails, what that means for our day-to-day work, in order to be able to deliver on the expectations of our customers and our other stakeholders. So that was the big learning for me: communicate, and don't let anything be excuse to do anything less than that.
I'll pick up on that. A couple of themes in there, perhaps, George. We had some questions earlier on the pandemic, and perhaps Michael, you could respond to how you think that sort of influenced or changed the way you communicated with any one of those three legs of the stool. And to some extent, I think the question on all of our minds is, how much of what you learned do you think you'll continue to apply moving forward, or was it a very unique situation? So lessons learned and what you think you'll do differently going forward in terms of communications.
Well, I think we've all learned how to navigate Zoom and WebEx much more effectively. So we'll take that lesson with us far into the future. But in seriousness, similarly, I think, and maybe this is an extension of the Accelerating the Arches answer, but it was very clear early on that communications was going to be very important. And even in the absence, perhaps, of certainty, we knew that was going to be extremely important to increase our volume of communications to the entire system. And a lot of that was done at the market level, but the markets also needed direction from kind of corporate, right, and from the center. And that, I think that is certainly a lesson that we'll take forward when we look at some of our benchmarks in terms of sentiment and pulse. We saw people really needing to hear what the company was doing, how it was working to keep people safe, how it was working. You heard from Bob to keep supply open. And so communications just, I think, took a very, very, very important role and played a role of a bit of a dot connector, for the organization. And from what I've heard, that's not unique to our company. I think a lot of companies saw communications playing in that space. And that was very important. The other thing I'd say is credibility was important too, knowing the answers that you can have as a company and the answers that you don't. Knowing that, for us, we quickly partnered with the Mayo Clinic, as well as our markets, partnered with other health institutions in their markets, to be able to get answers to questions that they didn't have. And I think that was very important for customers, for crew, for employees. And that was something that I think we would take with us going forward, borrowing and really tapping into the expertise outside of your company to help steer and navigate forward was invaluable for us.
Excellent. One or two maybe from here. It's a pretty general strategy question, I guess, Michael, which is around what do you think some of the biggest changes within the industry that you see, either specific to QSRs or whatever competitive set you frame or define, or even communications. Like as you're looking forward now, as a communications leader, what do you think are some of the biggest changes or challenges that you face?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I'll preface this by saying that anything I share from McDonald's perspective has probably already been shared and is not my own original thinking. But you've heard, our CEO certainly talk about things like digital, and when you look at our Accelerating the Arches plan, I think there's a lot you can pull out from within that, because it was created, frankly, within the context of COVID, but also knowing that that there would be some return or some exit from the pandemic, and that strategy would still need to endure. And certainly the importance of digital engagement pulls through on that plan. I think that customers have become acutely aware of things like cleanliness and safety, and that is that's certainly something that so when we communicate, talking about the steps that you've done to keep people safe, to keep customers safe, I think is took a different level of importance. And you can look at anything from a Harris poll or Morning Consult or other bodies of research that show that rising up, and it's hard to see that not having such heightened importance in any kind of near term for us. So strategy wise, I would point back to the strategy that we've put out, because I think that was, again, within COVID and with an eye out of it. And on a comm standpoint, people became very, very, very central to the messages that customers want to hear, that frankly employees and others want to hear, and that a company must deliver.
Thanks, George. You want to do some more from the class, or I've got a bunch more write-ins if you want me to keep going. So
yeah, let me try to get a couple of figures almost. You want to go? We got over 100 questions. So for anyone who has some questions, that's the background.
Hi. How does McDonald's adapt to new culture changes once the company has entered the market?
I want to make sure I got that question. The audio is a little bit off on my side. Do you mind asking one more time?
Yeah, sure. How does McDonald's adapt to new culture changes once the company has entered the new market?
So it's a great question. I haven't been here when we've entered a new market, right? So I in a personal experience, it'd be hard for me to answer that. That said, we are operating and have operated in, almost 120 markets. So there are not many markets that we haven't entered into. And my experience in having visited many of our markets around the world is I think picking up on that word that you used, which was adapt. And I think adaptation is critical in terms of as a market's needs or expectations evolve, that the company and the brand does so with it. And I was struck when I went to visit our market in Russia and meet with the team there, that, yes, McDonald's carries with it this kind of iconic American brand, but at the same time, it feels in Russia like a very Russian brand. It feels in Poland like a very Polish brand. It feels in Germany like a very German brand, and it feels, and having lived in China, like elements of a very Chinese brand. So I think that there's that balance that this company, that this brand has struck, that is not just adapting, but really integrating into and becoming part of that fabric, both in the food that it serves, to the communications that it offers, and its marketing. I would also note that I think a franchise business obviously lends itself to that, where there are owners who are locally invested in the community. That's both true when you're talking about regions or communities in the US, right? Or when you're looking around the world. And I think that is part of the secret sauce of this company and how it's able to really adapt and integrate into the communities in which it operates.
Super, thanks for that, Michael. So we have some questions which are more personal. I think Amy is very happy with your background. You can go ahead, Amy.
Hi there, Michael. I also have an undergrad degree in journalism or nonfiction writing. How has this skill set helped you as a chief communication officer at McDonald's?
It's a great question. So I touched a little bit on this as kind of plan B, but I feel very grateful for the opportunities and kind of where this plan took me. I would say specifically to the skills that I learned as a journalist in training and then in practice, I think that there are two things. One is confidence. So when you're dealing with a reporter, that especially beginning, you're not really understanding what your roles are versus their role. There's a bit of an intimidation factor. I kind of, having been in a newsroom, I felt like I understood what their needs were. And so that probably gave me a bit of a leg up there. I also think that, we work in a very multifaceted industry. So if you were to ask someone, like, define what the roles of communications are, you'll get a lot of different answers to that. And especially if you look at even the companies that were on your list before, what comms does may change a little bit from company to company. And I think what's important, regardless of what company you're at or what realm of communications you're in, is that everyone has a bit of their own superpower and knowing what you're really, really, really good at. Because you're not going to be good at all of it. So, I can tell you that I mentioned the performance and intelligence team. If I were to go sit within that team, I don't think it would work out very well for the team or for me. And being really, really transparent about that and aware of that is true. But for me, as a kind of trained in nonfiction writing, I always felt like I was going to be a pretty good writer because I just spent a lot of time focused on that. And so that helped me a lot. I would also just say that, kind of, Amy, you know this too, like the journalists that you really respect and that you follow are good because they work really, really hard. And that was a reminder for me that if I was going to be good at this, it was going to come because I'm willing to work really, really hard. And that helped me early on to make sure that I was repellent to any ego. And that's something that I carry with, to this day. I try to neutralize ego when I encounter it. And I certainly have, tried really hard to make sure that it's not something that I possess too much of.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. The name of the student is Michelle Warman, and she asks, if you could give yourself your best piece of advice before entering the workforce, what would that be?
Man, I've gotten some really good advice. So I'm really lucky for that. So like when I first started at an agency, a mentor of mine handed me a list of like 10 things that they had sent to their children and had sent it to me. And one of them was like, bring a pad and bring a pen and read every email twice. That was like, I think, number one and number two. And it seems so basic, but it's so important. That's specific. Holistically, I'd say before entering the workforce, do everything you can to make yourself the most interesting person that you can possibly be. I think when you're talking to people, whether it's, again, a reporter, a colleague, a boss, it's less about how good you are at that one thing and more about the mindset that you bring to the situation. And I think the more you invest in being an interesting person, the more helpful it is to creating that well-rounded mindset. And then lastly, I would say one thing I've learned, we were just talking about it as a team this morning, is that increasingly the pace of things have gotten for any industry, just, voluminous, right? And talk to anyone, and it's the rapidity, it's the volume of work and how, but I think the most important thing that you can control in that environment is to force yourself to slow down, force yourself to really scrutinize your thinking, disconfirm whether the assumption you have is right. I don't kick myself on any daily basis for not being able to fix a problem, but I do kick myself if I've made kind of a simple oversight or an error. And that was certainly true when I first started at an agency, started in the workforce, started as a reporter. And it's definitely true, today.
Thanks, Michael. Michael Demon, would you like to take some of your questions?
Yeah, let's see if I can pick up some good things. I really appreciate your counsel, Michael, to our students there. And, I think it's counter in a positive way to so much, popular culture that suggests, how you have to sort of crawl your way to the top and work yourself to the bone and all this sort of thing. And I think we talk a lot more at the school about, data and empathy and, things being human-centered and data, sort of trying to get these kind of balances in your life's experience and just generally being intellectually curious about the world around you, which is obviously the privilege an education like ours affords you to some extent, a chance to step back. So very much appreciate that. I guess I don't want to take us too far back, but there was an interesting question actually from our colleague, Professor Mark Sommerley, who had a question which is really sort of back into the field of activism and, speaking out on political sensitive issues, etc. His question really is about, given that very broad scale that you operate in across franchises and markets, etc., is how do you sort of manage the level of very local activism that might crop up? Is there a way to think about that ecosystem of activism? And you've talked obviously about how to link that to brand pillars or your values or your leadership platform, but one imagines it's a much more dynamic thing than that, given the number of countries, the number of franchisees, so the question really is about, how you're constantly getting a pulse of all those local activist moments or opportunities.
Pulse is I think a critical word to that. I mean, in our industry, in our line of work, surprises are really scary. You want to feel like you understand what's happening and you have good line of sight, and yet at the same time, that is almost impossible. So there is that tension of wanting to be able to see everything, but knowing that you probably won't be able to. But having as much infrastructure in place, we have a great team here that helps us with that within the communications team. So visibility is essential. The one thing I would just caution is that I think words like activism and crisis often get used to describe something that may be a little bit less hysterical or less dramatic. So that there are, moments of tension or unexpected stories, but that is to be expected, especially for a large brand in this environment. So I think what we try to do is to have some, I would dare say, sobriety in terms of what an issue is and, whether it's got a real potential impact our brand. And maybe even if it doesn't, if it's something that really requires us to say something on and to speak up on. So I think having the infrastructure to know what's going on and the fortitude to be able to assess it and say, okay, this may not be, an ember that catches a forest fire, is also very, very, very important.
So maybe we can take one last personal question, for one of the students related to that.
So this question is actually on behalf of our classmate Katrina, and she asked, being a chief communications officer is not easy. How do you ensure to consider everyone that you are trying to reach? How do you deal with the pressure?
Well, I think it goes a little bit to what I said in the beginning, where I'm here representing, an incredible team, and none of what we do would work without them, and all of what we do would work without me. So I think being very mindful of the team as much as you can is important. It's certainly a lesson that I've learned, in various stages of my career. So yes, you got to take care of yourself, but I'll put that aside for a second. I think you got to really be focused on the team, and that takes a lot of attention. And it's something that I can say humbly is something that I'm really working on, because I know that, again, for the McDonald's comms team in the last year alone, there's been just a number of challenges. So you're dealing with the pandemic as an individual, and then you're trying to deal with the pandemic as an employee, as a practitioner. So I really try to emphasize that in our discussions. I would say personally, I've struggled always with balance, and it's something that, there's that saying, wherever you go, there you are. The one thing I've tried to do, in more recently is, I really do try to unplug a little bit more. I used to think that was impossible to do, that was somehow a dereliction of duty. And I've come to learn that is the only way that you can really perform, whether you're in communications or another realm. The human brain just doesn't work well if it's always trying to work. And so that's something that I'm working on. It's a growth opportunity for me. But I've come to at least realize it's absolutely critical.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. And before I pass it back on to you, Michael Diamond, Michael, I want to thank you so much, right? Because everything that you have said today is going to be great for the students, for how they look at life and their careers and their promotions. So I think that, on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think you guys froze there, so I can't see you, but I'm waving back.
Oh,
All right. Well, I think we'll take it back. Julie has one slide she'll put up, and our colleagues will join us from New York. Michael, I genuinely want to thank you on behalf of all of us at the school. While you didn't benefit from our education, we hope you've exhibited extraordinary breadth around a lot of things we try and teach at the school, and we appreciate your sharing your counsel. The school has really set itself a mission, which I think is quite ambitious, which is to create transformative learning experiences that are steeped in the real world. And George's class, which is really just a sort of a beautiful prism for that, but a small part of the overall program, is a great example of what else is going on. And I stuck up a slide here, just if anybody who's not a direct student of ours is interested in the 2 master's programs that we offer, then certainly please get in touch with us via email or the website. There's both a master's in marketing and a master's in PR and corporate communications. But my real point is to acknowledge just the impact that having folks like you, Michael, speak with the students in the program has. I think many of us have that career moment where we heard someone speak or someone said something meaningful, and it really helped reframe how we thought about life. And I will immediately pick up on the wherever you go, there you are, on a very busy week, in my life, and a very challenging week for many of us across America in terms of this constant struggle, for racial justice and social equality, and on Earth Day for, climate, the voice of climate science. I think we all also need to take the moments to pause and reflect and think of the bigger picture. So really appreciate you sharing with us quite candidly and openly, both at the sort of strategy level, the professional level, and the personal level. So I think that's a wrap, George. But Michael, many thanks for your time. So
super. Thanks again.
Thank you all so much. It was an honor. Take care all.